learning is, oh, thanks, Sam. M's recording. Um, and I'll, just for the recording's sake, I think I'll like that. And then I was just gonna say, my general best form of learning is if I have something that I can sort of read. I don't learn as well if it's just auditory. And so with that in mind, I prepared a presentation that I thought I would use as a teaching method that would hopefully be helpful for others as well. But it was helpful for me in organizing, and it's also generally helpful for me in learning as well. So I thought it might be of value. So I'm going to share my screen. Can you see that? It says right skillful action. Okay, great. Um, cool. So it was sort of fun to engage the reading with a mind of how do I not repeat what the reading it says, but offer something in response to it. Um, and so hopefully that is what is going to be offered here. And I really appreciated there are several points in the reading that it felt like the emphasis within the teaching was that that right or skillful action is us expressing our true nature in the world. Um, and um, and that sort of our orientation at all times is sort of like how do we sort of engage from a place of wakefulness. Um, and so I thought that that would be sort of a useful place for us to spend a little bit of time. Um, I thought as I began to think about it, that um, an emphasis on action and conduct. So I think oftentimes, I think especially early on in my engagement with Buddhism, um, I think I oftentimes begin to think the primary thing is just meditating. But again and again throughout the Buddhist teachings, there is this emphasis that places attention on how we are showing up in the world, that that what we do on the cushion or on the chair is ultimately about allowing us to show up to the world differently. During the most recent retreat in Madison, Flint said several times that our sitting doesn't change the situations that are causing us the most distress, but it creates in us a greater capacity to meet those situations and hopefully be able to influence them in a positive way. And I thought that was such a nice way of talking about that sitting is essential, but that standing up and moving back out into the world is essential as well. Um, and so as I was thinking about the different ways in which ethical conduct or action shows up across different core teachings, I thought there's really this sense that how we show up in the world matters, and that the actions we take or the actions that we don't take, thinking about what we were just talking about with speech, can either contribute to cycles of suffering and harm, or create disruptions in that flow and contribute to the freedom of beings from that cycle, and hopefully ourselves included is certainly an important question, I think, for us to continue to keep in mind. Um, and um, and one of the phrases that came to mind was living in the relative, but never losing sight of the absolute. And that's part of our challenge in practice is to hold this bigger picture while still showing up to the in moment challenge that we need to meet with some sort of skillful action or response. Um, so I know that not everybody has necessarily studied the sort of the full scope of the precepts, but I thought I would just sort of call out a couple of things I thought were interesting as I was looking back at some of these core ideas. So within the three pure precepts, the way that we chanted in the full moon ceremony um, is I vow to refrain from all harming. I vow to do what is life-giving. I vow to live and be lived for the benefit of all beings. We vow to not create evil. We vow to practice good. We vow to actualize good for others. This vow embraces and sustains right conduct. This vow embraces and sustains every good. And this vow embraces and sustains all beings. I thought, you know, there's this way in which across core Buddhist teachings that there's sort of this flow between them. And certainly the 12 grave precepts sort of roll back up into the three pure precepts. And then sort of get captured in there in this sort of very succinct way that I think really emphasizes our intention is to engage in a way that is not harmful, and that is embodying and bringing forward good into the world. And sort of a return to our true nature, which I'll touch base about just a little bit further. I think Ruthie actually introduced me to the five remembrances some years ago, and the fifth remembrance states, "My actions are my only true belongings. I cannot escape the consequences of my actions. My actions are the ground on which I stand." I thought that was such again, a beautiful sort of way of continuing to sort of deepen into this idea of right action. And it sort of also references karma. So the idea that actions have consequences. And so this idea that there's cause and effect, and that our actions and our intentions can affect things and will affect things. And it's important that we keep that in mind as we choose and determine what we do in a given moment or in response to a given circumstance. So I thought those felt like pieces that came to mind as I was beginning to engage these chapters that we read for this week, and sort of spurred some further thoughts for me. So across the three different books, they all reference several of the grave precepts. Bhikkhu Bodhi primarily emphasizes three, but both Leanne Schutt and Koshin Paley Ellison emphasize these five, also referencing back to right speech, or sort of the different precepts around speech. And as I sort of read through these, I really appreciated the duality of holding both the prohibitory, sort of the thing that we are instructed not to do, but more so this sense of like, what is it that we're being pulled towards? What is it that's sort of being emphasized on an aspirational level? And really what that brought forward for me was the thought of, what is it that we are endeavoring to embody in the world? And Koshin Paley Ellison sort of references this in many different ways as he sort of talks through these different practice points and sort of says things like openness is a place of practice, or vulnerability or transparency is a place of practice. And it seemed to me that there was a number of things that got called forward around these primary precepts that were emphasized across the chapters, and that part of what we're called to embody is compassion and kindness, honesty, accordance with reality, vulnerability, transparency, generosity, contentment, openness, dignity, respect for the agency of others, and their ability to choose and make decisions for themselves, tenderness, clarity, and embodiment. And that's our aspiration is really to sort of embody these qualities and characteristics. And that will show up both in the things that we choose not to do, such as harming something that is living, or lying or deceiving others, but also in the ways in which we then make that turn towards supporting life in what ways we can, speaking truthfully, not speaking when it's not going to be skillful. And so our aim is to continue to bring these qualities into sort of expression within ourselves. I really appreciated Leanne's breakdown of this idea of effect and cause, and it sparked something that I'll sort of reference in a little bit more on the next slide. But I thought the sense of that harm and harming exists in the world, and that our aim should be to investigate it, to make sense of it, to explore it, bringing some sense of curiosity to it. Both if we are the cause of the harm, but also if we are on the receiving end of the harm, to look into it and pay attention to what's happening. And then as we do, as we begin to see some of the causes or the contributions that might exist, that are creating that sort of harm or that cycle of suffering, that our aim is then to abandon those causes and conditions and to let go of them, to turn towards them or turn away from them. And where there are things that are societally driven or societally maintained, there may be opportunities that we need to step into to work to challenge or dismantle those things, if it's racism or if it's other forms of oppression. That our aim in those moments, if we see the harm that's flowing from that, is to address the cause of it in what ways we can. And that's by doing so, we may begin to move towards a reduction or an ending of some suffering or some form of harm. And I think this to be developed, I think, is really it's about those qualities, is that we bring that aspiration into all those different situations to end suffering. And what this brought forward for me was our vows. Actually, was the vows that we consistently return to as a community, and the ways in which sort of right view is held within the four practice principles, which are a retelling of the Four Noble Truths. And I think especially coming off of a retreat in which we spent every day opening and closing our shared practice opportunities with morning and afternoon service. This really sort of struck me in a different way, or sort of drove home the ways in which our chants are consistently sort of calling us back to this place, and in some ways to what Leanne Schutt was pointing to in terms of looking at cause and effect. And so I thought I would just sort of revisit, because I know not everybody is going to have all the chants memorized, and we don't necessarily say them all on a regular basis. But what I thought about was we started with the four practice principles today, which speak to the existence of suffering, the causes of suffering, the way out of suffering, and that way out of suffering is by engaging the Eightfold Path. That being just this moment, compassion's way, sort of meeting the moment, and responding to it compassionately. And we don't necessarily always use the repentance chant in our regular Wednesday night gatherings or other practice periods. But the repentance chant reads, "All my ancient tangled karma," or in some translations, twisted karma, from beginningless greed, hate, and delusion, born through body, speech, and mind, I now fully avow. And then it's repeated with a we and all beings. But the repentance chant is essentially us saying, if we think about what Leanne Schutt was referencing in that last chart, we look at all of our conditioning, whether it's societal or familial or individual, experiential, the ways in which we've been shaped by the world, and we step forward and we say, I'm not going to continue to be sort of bound by that or sort of tangled up in that, as we think about the title of Koshin Paley Ellison's book. And so repentance is looking at all of those causes and conditions and saying, I'm going to be free from that. I'm going to sort of avow it, and turn away from it, sort of declare that that's not going to sort of hold me captive any longer. And then what we do in the series of chants is then we recite the refuges, and the refuges are taking refuge in Buddha, taking refuge in Dharma, and taking refuge in Sangha. And further it reads, we take refuge in Buddha before all being, immersing body and mind deeply in the way, awakening true mind. So we take refuge in wakefulness, in sort of seeing things as they truly are, seeing them clearly. Then we take refuge in Dharma before all being, entering deeply the merciful ocean of Buddha's way. And this is sort of meeting life as it is and allowing it to in some ways be our teacher. I heard a great statement that in a podcast a couple of weeks ago where he said, meeting life as though it is the curriculum. It is what we need to sort of respond to and meet. And I thought that was such a nice way of stating that. And then we take refuge in Sangha before all being, bringing harmony to everyone, free from hindrance, which begins to speak back to right action, I think, but also to this idea that that we are not separate from anyone. And so, I mean, there's both the Sangha of other practicing beings, but there's also this idea that we take refuge in sort of connectedness, and do our part to bring harmony to the relationships and to our interactions with others. And then what flows from that then is the Bodhisattva vow, which we chant fairly regularly, I think, in Awakening Together, and I know in Open Door as well. And that is that commitment or vow that, is also aspirational, but holds us towards sort of this bigger picture, towards this absolute idea where beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's way is unsurpassable. I vow to embody it. And so that sort of is then the vow that is sort of, when Lian Schutt says is we realize, the cause. Like, part of our realization is by making the commitment to these vows. So this might be a familiar quote to some. Flint has shared it before, but from Kobanchino Atagawa's book, Embracing Minds, he says, the more you sense the rareness and value of your own life, the more you realize that how you use it, how you manifest it, is all your responsibility. We face such a big task, so naturally we sit down for a while. And what this brought forward for me was sort of this question of, within the Zen tradition, sort of the question of sort of how does sitting practice factor into this? And Norman Fisher talks about this a little in his book, The World Could Be Otherwise, which is a reflection on the Paramitas. And he says, in meditation, you eventually see a direct connection between your fidgeting, your uncomfortable body, your obsessive mind, and your conduct. You see that when your conduct becomes kinder, more straightforward, and clearer, your meditation becomes easier and more focused, and vice versa. In long meditation retreats, this experience can be quite stark. And he says, ongoing meditation practice makes this connection even more obvious. You see that you never get away with anything, that shoddy conduct casts shadows on your mind and heart that you feel sooner or later as mental or physical discomfort when you sit down to meditate. So naturally, you become more sensitive to the little nicks and bruises to which the heart is subject. Hurtful things you used to say and do without particularly noticing, or things said and done to you that you brushed off, you now understand as consequential. It pains you to say, even to think, hurtful things. Meditation practice sensitizes you to others. And so I thought that was such a nice capturing of the ways in which our sitting practice, I think Kobanchino references, like, it's a big deal to think about the enormity of our responsibility to move through the world in a skillful way. And sitting down is a reasonable response to it. And that in our sitting practice, it allows us, one, as Flint says, to become a bigger container to meet the suffering of the world, but also helps us to see ourselves more clearly as well. So I thought on a practical level, as I began to think about, what our sitting practice begins to allow oftentimes is a greater amount of space, whether it's why am I about to talk, or why am I talking now, or why am I talking at all? When we're referencing speech, that hopefully our sitting practice creates some greater space so that we might begin to ask questions of ourselves before we act, and not just move from a place of reactivity. And so I thought, just from that, with that in mind, that these could be questions, they might not all be meaningful to everybody, but they might spark something that could be brought forward as you engage right action over the coming month. So what does love look like in this situation? What harm might arise from my actions? What action is intentional instead of reactive? What action is aligned with or reflects my vow, or values or commitments? Is this action absent of greed, hate, and delusion? What action is in the service of freedom? I know one of the things Flint has oftentimes talked about is sort of like with the idea that each interaction that we have with others might move them one small turn towards freedom, um, and perhaps us as well. And so what action is in the service of freedom? Does this action reflect an understanding of interdependence? One of the things that always stayed with me from our precept study was the idea that separation is suffering. Um, and that when we see ourselves as separate, we are more exposed um, to suffering. And then what action flows from a place of centeredness, balance, or uprightness? One of our precepts core books was Being Upright, which is a book by Reb Anderson, and sort of using that sense of uprightness as a description of the way in which we want to engage the world. And I thought, as I was sort of finishing the list of questions, I thought, there's something so important about including ourselves in this, in the way that we, Coach and Paley Ellison talked about, the ways in which we, can be harmful to ourselves, both through the way that we talk to ourselves, the way we treat ourselves, the things that we deprive ourselves of. And so always, I think, thinking about how am I included in the way in which I'm choosing this action? Am I thinking of my own well-being, not over and above anybody else's, but as part of the whole? And so two other things came up in the past week that felt resonant as I was sort of coming into this. Both of which I had heard before, but sort of where I was reminded of. So tikkun olam is a Hebrew term or phrase that means repairing the world. Sort of this concept that to be thoughtful about our actions and how they might improve and repair the world and leave the world a better place. So the quote that's in the image that might be too small for people, but is you are not obligated to complete the work, but neither are you free to abandon it. And so as I thought about sort of ways to sort of weave in other concepts, these two both sort of were brought forward in this past week. Sort of this one I thought was really useful, and this can be another reference point for us as we think about any given action that we might take. Is it in the service of repairing the world? Is it in the service of leaving the world a better place? And then coming back from Hawaii, Emily and I were reintroduced to the phrase of living pono, which I had to look up. I think I had been introduced to it before, but in Hawaiian, pono stands for righteousness and balance. So if a person is living in balance, it means that they have struck the right balance in their relationships with other things, people, and places. So the whole world or existence is included. And so there's a level of conscious awareness to do right by themselves and by others, and by the environment. So there's a big emphasis, I think, in Hawaiian culture on, caring for the world in an effective way. And there was a lot of overlap as I was looking at it. So one thing I found, so that living pono means being virtuous and true to your nature. So that felt nice as we think about expressing our Buddha nature in the world. Having respectful relationships with everyone, including family, neighbors, and others, as we think about not misusing sexuality, and not harming others. Taking only what you need and giving back when you can. As we thought about not stealing and giving what we have, treating others how you want to be treated, caring for the environment, and leaving places better than when you have arrived or when you arrived. And the idea behind it is that moral behavior leads to happiness for everyone, which I thought was just such a nice way of thinking about our Bodhisattva vow, to the commitment of the freedom and reduced suffering of others. So I thought those just felt really resonant coming off of some time in Hawaii and being reminded of Tikkun Olam this past week. I thought those felt like nice ways to sort of think about sort of reference points for us as we consider our actions. And then the last thing I thought I would leave you with is an example from the book Zen is Right Here, where a student asked Suzuki Roshi if he kept an eye on his students to see if they were following the precepts, the Buddhist guidelines of conduct. And he said, I don't pay any attention to whether you're following the precepts or not. I just notice how you are with one another. And that's, moment by moment, the ways that we are with one another, is the fulfillment of the precepts or not. And so, um, those were some of the ideas and thoughts that came to mind as I both did the reading and then sort of reflected on the concept of right action. So, hopefully it's of some use to the group. So I thought I'll stop screen sharing there and we can stop recording, and then we've got some time for discussion before our time runs out.